having right now on reproductive freedom under surveillance. My name's Albert Cahn. I'm the executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And we hold this monthly webinar series in partnership with RadTech to discuss, a wide variety of topics on surveillance, technology, and social justice. And we're really pleased to have a forum to bring together community organizers, experts in the field, and discuss both how surveillance technology is impacting all of our lives and the ways that we can fight back. For those of you who are unfamiliar with S.T.O.P, we're a New York-based anti-surveillance organization that's, just a few years old. We were founded in 2019, but we do a lot of work to push back against the growth of the surveillance state, particularly focusing on the ways that surveillance powers expand policing and pose a particular threat to Muslim Americans, immigrants, and LGBTQ individuals, and of course, BIPOC communities. For today's session, we're joined by two incredible guests who have been doing a lot of work on this topic. So Hayley Tsukayama is Senior Legislative Activist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I was going to say, if you aren't familiar with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but if you're here, you must be familiar with them because they are the single most prominent, powerful, and important group fighting for digital civil rights. And Hayley does tremendous work there, focusing on state legislation. Prior to joining EFF, she spent nearly 8 years as a consumer technology reporter at the Washington Post, which, a small community newspaper down in DC, and it has written a ton of stories on the industry's largest companies. And we've had the pleasure of working with Hayley on a lot of advocacy here in New York and other state bills, and she's doing great work on health data, digital privacy for pregnant people, and work at both the federal level and the state level. And we also have Jolynn Dellinger, who is the Stephen and Janet Beer Visiting Lecturer and a Keenan Senior Fellow at Duke Law's Keenan Center for Ethics, where she teaches privacy and ethics and does work in the area of ethical tech. And I just found out is the advisor to an amazing student group that we partner with there at Duke. In addition to teaching privacy law and policy at Duke Law, she's a senior lecturing fellow and an adjunct professor at the UNC School of Law and a member of the board of directors for the Triangle Privacy Research Hub and and a member of the Future of Privacy Forum's advisory board. I thought I had a lot of titles. You've got way more. This is and all impressive ones. Yeah, we're staring down a very damaging, dystopian, and dreadful Supreme Court ruling that in just a matter of hours, potentially could reshape American constitutional law as we know it and the, essential liberties that had been enjoyed for more than 50 years by half of the US population. We're talking about the loss of a constitutional right to abortion care. And before we go into the horrifying ways that this will unfold in the weeks and months and years to come, and as a preview for all of you, it will be worse than you think. Why don't we spend a little bit of time looking at the problematic state of criminalized abortion today, even with Roe on the books, even with that as good law? Because while we know that the upcoming opinion in Dobbs is likely to make things much, much worse, it is hardly a reproductive rights utopia today. So, who would like to start off the conversation looking at some of the criminalizations of the civil bans that we see being enforced now?
Well, I could start on that. I think it's a great opening question because it brings together a couple of threads of this movement, reproductive justice movement. And I think when we're looking at the state of criminalization today, a lot of people who have been involved in the abortion rights movement are very aware of limitations on access and restrictions on availability, because they exist everywhere across the country. And that's been a big focus. But at the same time, there are a series of criminalizations, basically, of pregnancy outcomes that are going on in various states, even under Roe, that I think get a little bit of less attention from folks who are kind of feel that they're within the right to choose movement, but that have been really effectively and amazingly covered by scholars that are in this reproductive justice movement. And so some of the things that I had for you there were to call out the work of Michelle Goodwin, who wrote the book Policing the Womb. And I'll throw some of these in the chat for people if they want to look up further resources. But the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers also has some excellent work in this area on how laws redefining a person to include the unborn can actually also be used in prosecutions of women who are pregnant for various pregnancy outcomes. And in some reporting by the Brennan Center, we see that more than 1,200 women have been arrested for pregnancy outcomes after Roe. And then also the Guttmacher Institute has provided some information about women who are arrested and charged after attempting to self-induce. So there's fetal homicide laws and feticide laws that can be used against people for self-inducing abortion. And none of this is really what some of these laws were contemplated to accomplish. Also child endangerment laws or exposure to chemicals laws that have been, and it's a lot of prosecutorial discretion out there and how people choose to use these laws. But it's criminalizing motherhood, it's criminalizing pregnancy. And I think that this is what we can look at as a precursor to what's going to happen going forward.
Of course, and one other person whose work I wanted to call out is Cynthia Conti Cook, a longtime collaborator with S.T.O.P, who's done amazing work looking at criminalization looking at criminalization of pregnant people under existing statutes, and really keeping in mind that when we're looking at the intersection of criminal injustice and reproductive rights, there are these targeted laws that are systematically seeking to criminalize abortion, but then there, like you said, there is this broad reframing of existing laws that had nothing to do with abortion or reproductive justice at the time they were passed, that are then used as cudgels to target pregnant people, and very much fear the same will continue. Now, Hayley, I was wondering if maybe you could speak a bit to some of the surveillance tools that we already see being used to enforce those types of criminal laws, because I know we've already seen examples of electronic search histories and things like that being used to prosecute pregnant people.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's definitely right. I think, we talk a lot about sort of the surveillance data infrastructure that has popped up to look at a lot of different things, but certainly in the case of pregnancy outcomes and reproductive justice, you're absolutely right. You see, it's rare that they're kind of used to initiate the investigation, but then once it's been initiated, you do see people looking at things like, what have you searched for? Have you searched for abortifacients? Have you sought out information about pregnancy, outcomes? So we're definitely seeing that information get pulled in. I think looking forward to kind of tip our hand into the rest of the conversation, we're really worried about other tools that we've seen, location data gathering, warrants for really to try and identify how people are moving through the world, being used also to prosecute these cases. So it's very troubling.
And I think that's an important distinction for this conversation, is that, there are a few different ways that surveillance will play a role in criminalizing, reproductive health care in the coming years. One will be when someone's already been identified for whatever reason as a suspect, you know, looking at all of the electronic records that we build up throughout our days. But perhaps a more chilling possibility is the way that electronic dragnets can be used to identify people who are pregnant or seeking care in the first place. Because in a world where abortion is driven underground, one of the hard things for police will be identifying who is even pregnant to begin with.
Mhm.
Before we get to the horrible technology coming for us, I was wondering, would either of you want to talk about some of the bounty bills that we've seen? Because it isn't just states that are trying to criminalize reproductive health, it's private individuals that are using some of these newer laws to sue those who are helping pregnant people get care.
Sure. So SB 8, which people might be familiar with from Texas, is one of those civil laws. And it basically does, as you said, create a bounty hunter type of system where they are enabling individuals in Texas to sue other individuals in Texas. My understanding is not the actual woman who's seeking an abortion, but people who are providing abortions and people who are helping people obtain and provide abortions. It's a pretty broad reach in the context of those laws, and Oklahoma has a similar law to Texas. And in the civil context, part of the concern, I think, is that, first of all, this doesn't eliminate or take the place of criminal liability. You might also have a statute that enables criminal charges to be brought against women post-Roe. But the civil also presents serious privacy issues. And I think we just have to think about whether this is really the kind of society that we want to live in, and what kind of information gathering does this suggest that people might engage in, whether it's individuals or whether it's right to life groups who are trying to enforce this law on their own by bringing actions. And I think that the penalty is $10,000 per violation if you establish that somebody violated this law. But it creates a situation where we're watching our neighbors, we're investigating our neighbors, our friends, our family. The privacy incursions are huge. And so then I think we also need to think about the role that data brokers may play in that, and the information that data brokers make available on the open market that people could get access to.
Yeah, and sorry, I think just to piggyback off of that, we think a lot about, of course, government use of databases of them tapping into that. But Jolynn makes the excellent point that we also see that stuff on the open market that anybody can access. So it really does speak to sort of, there are two fronts that you have to be thinking about, right? Both the private sector and the public sector, which makes it really scary.
And even worse, it's two commingled fronts because they work together in partnership. And I think that sometimes we can just lose sight of how creepy this has gotten, because imagine 40 years ago being told that the government is going to encourage your neighbors to sue you for exercising your rights, and you'll get to partner with shadowy companies to get the data to do it. It really feels like something out of a badly written authoritarian novel. And yet this has become increasingly the norm. But of course, as bad as the private surveillance can be, we know government surveillance powers are a lot worse. And so I was thinking we could now, turn to the thing that has so many of us really freaked out, and that's what are the search technologies, the surveillance technologies that agencies can turn to in tracking pregnant people. Maybe Hayley, if you can kick that off.
Kind of give you the list of horribles. Yeah, so there are quite frankly a lot of ways, right? So we've been able to work together, S.T.O.P and EFF, on talking about things like geofence warrants or keyword warrants, which are sort of these really broad warrants looking for people who are in a particular area or who may have been looking for a particular thing. So that's of major concern, right? You could see. Go ahead.
Well, I feel like these are, most people find these just inconceivable the first time they hear
Yes.
about it. But so could you just like help break it down for folks how it actually works, that through one warrant you can just like surveil an entire area?
I mean, I think that's really, I mean, that is it, right? Yeah. So I think about this mostly in the context of things like protests, right? So like you could see, if you're the police, you could say, okay, I want everybody who is in, this area, I want to know what their devices are, and, that identifying information about their device. And it's just a dragnet. So if you just happen to be going to the grocery store that's next to the public square where where your supermarket is next to the public square, then you too can get swept up in these warrants. And there's just no logic of, like you need the warrant to get information that's pertinent to the investigation. It's just you can sweep everybody up in it. So it really is a fishing expedition in the like broadest sense of the word. And yeah, it is mind-blowing that this is allowed. Yeah.
Oh, Jolynn, were you going to add something on that point?
Well, I was just thinking that in terms of like how that would play out post-Roe, I'm not sure if folks have had a chance to see this amazing new documentary, The Janes, that talked about all of the great work that these women from the University of Chicago did to help provide abortions to people pre-Roe. But if you'd imagine somebody trying to continue to provide abortions secretly in some of these states that ban it, if a law enforcement officer had a sense, or law enforcement generally had a sense of where something like that might be happening, a geofence warrant could be a way to get information about a lot of people around a specific area at a specific time, and try to get more information to follow up in that way.
And I think another example is if the state of Texas has shut down all lawful abortion clinics within its borders, it still knows that residents can travel to New York to gain access to care here. And so there's nothing to stop Texas from, getting a Texas state court to order Google to identify every person going to that New York clinic, in the hopes of, and this will raise lots of constitutional issues down the road, but in the efforts of trying to punish people who get care in New York and leave Texas in the process. Yeah, like that's one of the things I think is also on the horizon. The idea that state, and we already see states trying to pass bills that make it a crime to leave the state for the intent of getting an abortion, or which make it I believe Oklahoma has one bill that would make it a crime to terminate any pregnancy conceived in the state of Oklahoma, regardless of where abortion care is received. So there will be this entire effort to then use these geofence warrants to target clinics elsewhere in the country.
Yeah. And, bringing up movement, I think that's another area that we've seen a lot of, surveillance equipment be deployed at, kind of tracking where people are moving. So things like automated license plate readers, where they, are trying to recognize where your license plate goes and where your license plate is and where it may travel to. I think that's another thing, if we're really talking about physical sites where abortion, care may be taking place. That's another really big concern. And we've definitely seen ALPR data move across state lines, almost without, a lot of times without law enforcement even in one state even realizing it's being accessed by law enforcement in another state. Though of course, sometimes they know and they don't care. But that is another, really big area. We're really thinking about the transportation, getting people to areas where they can have care, to states where they can have care. That's another major area of concern for us.
And then, Jolynn, what are some of the other surveillance tactics that you're most concerned about when you think about, what's on the precipice?
Are we still in Dragnet or potentially with individuals?
Well, why don't we go with other Dragnet searches to start?
People have mentioned The use of FemTech apps in that way. I'm not really quite sure that that would be the most effective or efficient way to use FemTech information. So I would probably hold that over to more of the individual. I think keyword searches would be an issue. Again, with a class, I was trying to have people imagine, if you are a young woman, say 15, 16 years old in Mississippi or somewhere where there is no provision of abortion, and you find yourself pregnant, what's the first thing that you would do to try to get information? And maybe you would go down the street to your local library, but chances are you would use your phone and do a search. And so I think being able to do keyword searches for abortion, for mifepristone and misoprostol, for medication abortion, for what are my options? I mean, there's any number of keyword searches that I think could be something that law enforcement looks at to try to find out what's happening in various areas.
And while we haven't seen this as often as with Geofence warrants, we already know that Google receives keyword warrants where they will, be ordered to identify every user who has searched for the term, for a specific term or a specific address. And so it's very easy to imagine police saying, I want to know every user in the state of Texas who's searched for mifepristone or who's searched for Planned Parenthood. Another thing that comes up, though, in that example you brought up was the idea of going to the library. And one of the things I'm curious about is, do you think that we'll see libraries, schools, and other institutions that are under filtering mandates to filter out objectionable content being put in a position where they're banned from providing medically accurate information about abortion care?
That's a great question that I truly had not thought of until you raised it. With respect to librarians, I do know that librarians, and every librarian I've ever met personally in my life, is an absolute champion of free access to information, intellectual inquiry. And I believe every librarian out there will do everything they can to preserve not only access, but anonymous access for every person that walks in the door of a library. But how much they're allowed to do that, I think you're right, is a good question.
I totally agree that I have no plans, nor would I ever want to tangle with the librarians because they are an amazing force. But yeah, I think especially you mentioned schools. Like, I think schools probably will see. I mean, it's hard to say anything. I don't have a crystal ball, an accurate crystal ball. Well, I don't have any crystal ball, but I do think schools and universities and places that do tend to see more of those filtering. That filtering kind of show up. I think they are definitely at risk. And, I would worry about the local library. I think it could be a fight.
So, Jolynn, you had mentioned FemTech earlier. I was wondering if you could go into some of the concerns that you saw being raised around that data in particular and how it could be weaponized by police.
Sure, and there have been a lot of great articles on this very topic. Elizabeth Joe has written on this, and Zeynep Tufekci. And I think, the idea is not to cause alarm and panic among people. And we also want to recognize with FemTech, a lot of these apps, I'm not going to say a lot of them, but a good number of them are thinking that they could make great strides in women's health by providing these types of apps. Like, we know women are understudied in medicine. We know men have more of the research done on them. So having this data about women could have such amazing possibilities. But if we have to worry about that data just being sold, which we do because they're not covered by HIPAA for the most part, right? We don't have decent commercial data privacy legislation. So we have to worry about it in a number of ways. And now we're adding this to the list. So the kind of thing that FemTech apps do is allow people to keep track of their menstrual cycle, to keep track if they're trying to get pregnant, when they have sex, what kind of contraception they use when they have sex. Honestly, the kind of questions some of these FemTech apps, you would be amazed. How did you enjoy sex, when you had it? There's so much information. And one of those pieces of information is the first day of your last period. which we know is a piece of information that's very relevant to dating the gestational age of a fetus. So if you have included information like that in your FemTech app, well, if somebody has a suspicion about you, targeted suspicion about you, that's a third party. Can they just go to that party and get that information? Can they look at your device and see what you have put on that app on your device? So I think that there's a lot of questions, but I do think some of the FemTech apps are trying to respond. So some are saying, look, we're in Germany. We're complying with GDPR, and we're not gonna honor these requests that we get from law enforcement in the United States. There are people who are taking that approach. There was another FemTech app called Euki, I believe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but EUKI, where the technologists had come up with very interesting ways to try to be privacy protective with the structure, the actual build of the app itself. So among other things, there were 2 different passwords. So if you were required to put in a password in a compromising situation, you could choose password number 2, which would bring up a fake app and wouldn't even expose your information on your device. Again, none of these things are fail-safe or foolproof, but it's nice to see software engineers, technologists taking innovation to the level of let's protect privacy. What can we do to use code to protect privacy, to use architected design to protect privacy in this area, which is really a neat thing to see.
And I do think that's such a crucial point to bring up, because the reason Geofence warrants, keyword warrants, and these other digital dragnets work is because of design choices made by the companies that build these platforms that aggregate our data and then make it susceptible to this sort of governmental investigation. So they may not get a choice about whether or not to comply with a court order once it comes in, but they have complete discretion about whether to collect that data in the first place.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it's of course hard to say exactly how people should comply or should react to a decision that hasn't been released yet. But I do think one thing we can say to companies, and one thing we have said to companies at EFF is, reevaluate your own data practices. Like, are you practicing good data minimization? Are you only collecting what you actually need to provide the service? Are you retaining it for longer than you need? Because, you can't hand over information that you don't have. So if you have good, limits on the retention of that information, then that is another thing that I think companies particularly could be doing.
I mean, data minimization is where it's at, if you ask me. And another thing that some of these FemTech apps are doing that's related is allowing the data to be stored on the device and not on a server. So that, I mean, again, if they get a hold of your device, you need to use that second password. But having that localized storage and not have it on the servers, that's the service or the app taking a hit. If they don't have your data, they can't use your data. But that's also making a choice that protects consumers and prevents harm to consumers in many ways. And so, one of the things Hayley and I were talking about earlier that people may not think about when they're thinking about the crushing weight of dogs and what it's going to be. But this is related to bigger privacy issues in the country. And we stand out as the United States as a country that lacks a comprehensive privacy law. We literally stand out. China has a comprehensive privacy law. We do not. Right? The EU has a GDPR. We do not have a comprehensive privacy law. And you'll see, if you're on Twitter, you'll see a lot of talking about that. This week, there's a bipartisan effort underway. But of course, these efforts have been underway for 20 years. I'm hoping for more, but I hope that people can see that really supporting federal legislation, something that's comprehensive, but also something more targeted, like Elizabeth Warren has recently proposed something that would limit the data that data brokers can collect that is about health or location, and it's specifically in response to this type of thing. The Fourth Amendment is Not for Sale Act that Wyden proposed, also another huge help in this area. All of these things are incremental. Nothing by itself is a silver bullet. But if we view working towards getting representatives and senators that believe that privacy matters as one of our goals, it will help at the edges. Because if they don't have the data, they can't sell it. Right? So if we can get some rules in there, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Well, I am sure there's some startups out there that would try to sell data they don't actually have, but yeah, no, it is one of the most powerful protections we have. Sorry, Hayley, you were going to say something.
Oh no, I mean, I was gonna 100% echo that, and I think too, a lot of times, again, thinking more about general data privacy, we talk about potential privacy harms, and legislators say, well, tell me the story, like, give me the example of what that looks like, or talk to me about sort of how that plays out in someone's real life. We have a prime example right here of those real harms, and so I think in many ways I hate to think of this as helping anything, right? But it helps us tell that story. It helps to articulate those harms to policymakers much more clearly.
And no, I think that's the lesson of criminal justice reform and other civil rights movements throughout US history. It takes a critical mass of injustice to move lawmakers to actually make the painful choices to protect us going forward.
Yeah.
But speaking of legislation, Hayley, I know you're working on a bunch of different bills. As hoping you might sort of explain some of the pieces of legislation that you see as the biggest priorities in responding to this particular threat.
Yeah, so happy to do that. EFF is based in California, and California has already something called the Reproductive Privacy Act. And so we have a state right to abortion in California. One thing that we are looking at is a bill called AB 2091, which is sponsored by Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California, with Assemblymember Mia Bonta. Sorry, I just go into my bill number recitation. But what it does is that I think we hope will be a model for other states who want to sort of protect data from leaving the state, to kind of create a sanctuary state for reproductive health. So it basically says, if a healthcare provider in California gets, a subpoena or another request based on another state's law that interferes with California's own reproductive freedom laws, that they can say, I'm not going to comply with that. It also prohibits people from being compelled to provide information that would identify someone who's sought an abortion in that, sought or obtained an abortion in that scenario. So it's really kind of pushing back at sort of what states that do believe in this right can do against states that don't believe in this right, and try and prevent some of that cross-state data flow. So that's one thing. On the federal level, we're also, speaking about a recently introduced bill called the My Body, My Data Act by Representative Sarah Jacobs, that also really tries to put those data minimization rules onto companies that collect personal information about reproductive or sexual health. So the idea is, to protect people who are using those apps or are using Google searches, that kind of thing, and kind of just gives people some basic rights to that information. So access, deletion, so that if you are concerned, you can put in a request to delete, and they can do that. And then also that they're not over collecting information. So those are a couple of ways that we've tried to look at it. Obviously, as Jolynn said, nothing is a silver bullet, but I do think that these are a lot of different approaches. There are a lot of different attack vectors, right, that we're thinking about. And these are a couple of approaches that we're working on right now. And I will give a lot of credit to, the reproductive justice folks, because they've seen this coming for a long time. And so they have been asking, okay, who is holding data? What are ways that it gets across state lines? What can we do? And so we've been really happy to work with them and learn from them about sort of the threats that they see, and then try to plug in our expertise where it makes the most sense.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead, John.
Well, I just wanted to go back to your comment about the protections for healthcare providers in the California law that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to say how important those are. And if you look at the history there's a great book, When Abortion Was a Crime, by Professor Leslie Regan. If you look at her coverage of pre-Roe, When Abortion Was a Crime, and the work of Michelle Goodwin in Policing the Womb, you really see the extent to which healthcare providers are essentially have been coerced into being the informants for law enforcement, and things like dying declarations that they made women sign when they came in septic from a botched abortion back in the 40s and 50s, all the way through detaining women on their way out of an abortion clinic and submitting them to gynecological exams where they had rubber catheters removed from their body and used those women to testify against providers. But providers have been used to provide the information about women who are seeking the abortions to then find other people providing the abortions, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's a situation where if we can protect those healthcare providers from feeling that coercion or losing their license or being subject to insurance problems, it seems like that would be a huge benefit so that women don't have to be concerned that the healthcare system might operate against them. It's just such a disincentive for seeking care, for prenatal care, all across the board, is worrisome. And then I think that there are two other things that we would be concerned about, which are crisis pregnancy centers and Catholic hospitals who don't or won't provide abortion care, who may cooperate because they want to with law enforcement. And people show up at a crisis pregnancy center or a Catholic hospital not understanding that that type of care is not available to them from one of those places. So anyway, I just think there's so much around the healthcare providers, and I was just so glad to hear that you are looking at ways to protect them as well.
But we also have to acknowledge the problem that healthcare providers have actively played a role in policing reproductive access. In a lot of forums, we've seen a lot of pregnant people being subjected to involuntary drug testing and other medical exams, and having that evidence used against them. Really invasive, warrantless, suspicionless searches that would seem to violate any semblance of a right against search and seizure. And so there's unfortunately that history to deal with as well. And with regards to crisis pregnancy centers, one thing that we've been looking into a lot at S.T.O.P is what happens when police start replicating the tactics of crisis pregnancy centers directly, setting up fake accounts on social media platforms in order to trick pregnant people to identifying themselves. Because again, in a world without lawful abortion care, there's going to be this effort to use whatever mechanism is available to try to identify those who are pregnant. But sorry, go ahead, Hayley.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I mean, and I think that's absolutely right. Particularly crisis pregnancy centers. I mean, when I was a reporter, so in my past life, as I often say, I certainly remember, that these crisis pregnancy centers would put ads on searches for abortion, right? So that would be the top result that people would click it, and then you could track them through the online advertising surveillance infrastructure, which of course is very sophisticated and able to re-identify people. And so I think it's absolutely right to be concerned about those kinds of things and those kinds of groups.
I wanted to pivot just to one of the topics that may seem a little dry to some people, but is indispensable to all of the lawyers, which is the Fourth Amendment, the constitutional right against searches. I was just talking about how these practices seem to really go beyond what would seem to be allowable under that. And Jolynn, I was hoping you could maybe tell us a bit about what the state of that Fourth Amendment protection is when it comes to these, reproductive surveillance technologies.
I think it's a big unknown, but for those who may not know, the Fourth Amendment generally protects persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. And generally speaking, if a search is conducted with a warrant supported by probable cause, it's going to be thought to be reasonable. But there are a lot of searches, of course, that are done without warrants, because there are exceptions to when you need a warrant. Things like search incident to arrest, or plain view, or exigent circumstances. And then there's also the problem of, what if something's not a search? And so when we look at what is a search after Katz, it's, is there a reasonable expectation of privacy, subjective and objective reasonable expectation of privacy? So the reason I just mentioned that is because it's relevant to the third party doctrine, which is kind of a carve out, right? So we have this history of understanding that if you have shared information with a third party, you no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that information. Well, I personally don't think that made a lot of sense in the 70s, but it definitely doesn't make sense today in the digital environment. I mean, if you can just think about what possible information is there that you have not shared with a third party in some way, shape, or form. So it really puts a lot of information out there and makes it accessible to law enforcement, information that they might be able to get without a warrant at all. But assuming that there is a search, and assuming that a warrant is needed, and assuming that we're talking about a state that has criminalized certain conduct, chances are they could get a warrant. And so in this recent article that Stephanie Pell and I wrote together for Lawfare blog, we're talking about, is the Fourth Amendment in that scenario even really something that can protect women in this situation? Because if they have probable cause that a law criminalizing abortion has been violated, they can get a warrant. And if they have a warrant, they can get your phone. And they can use mobile extraction devices to say what is on your phone, and think about what's on your phone. All the searches that you've done, all the communications you've had with people that you trust, everything that you might have purchased, mifepristone or misoprostol, for example, all of that might be on your phone. And I like to talk about this issue of abortion because it particularly draws or evokes all the different facets of privacy. We're talking about your actual physical privacy, your bodily integrity. We're talking about decisional privacy and the ability to make autonomous decisions about the most important things in your life. And we're talking about informational privacy. And the idea of criminalizing something that you do with your actual body in the context of reproduction is a perfect storm of privacy violation. And the Fourth Amendment, in our view, and I know that we want to have some upbeat thing here, and this is not upbeat in any respect, but it's like the Fourth Amendment just can't protect us if states are allowed to make those crimes.
Yeah, that's definitely not the uplifting part of
No, sorry.
No, but I mean, it does speak to this fact that, constitutional doctrine is slow moving in many areas, is particularly slow moving when it comes to technology. And what we see then is this sort of acute need for the sort of work that Hayley is doing, pushing forward state legislation, federal legislation that can more rapidly address the sort of threats that we see unfolding on the ground. Well, I see that we already have a couple of questions, and would just invite everyone in the audience to please bring in more. And I want to make sure that we start turning to those now, so we leave plenty of time. So the first one from Chris, it says that for states that have more liberal abortion laws, are there laws we can enact that give protections against warrants/requests? For example, can states implement rules that says to companies with data, you don't need to respect a warrant from some sheriff in Wyoming, Wisconsin, I don't know my state abbreviations, if the crime is getting an abortion?
So that in many ways is sort of what our bill is seeking to do. I mean, I think ours is focused on healthcare providers. I think there are There are lots of interesting problems you run into when you're trying to get companies to do something or not to do something, right? You run into their First Amendment rights. But I do think that I think there are ways to sort of condition it on consumer consent, right? And so anyway, and then that gets back as well to data minimization and deletion, right? If you can't set up a regime where somebody has to consent to sharing something, as you probably couldn't in the law enforcement context, then at least you could say, well, we don't have it, or we never collected it. It is hard though. It's hard.
It seems to me like as a constitutional matter, just it's a lot easier to tell the companies it's illegal to collect this data in the first place than it is to say you cannot comply with an out-of-state warrant. I'm not sure how one state could make it unlawful for a company to comply with another state's court order without creating just a truly sort of nightmarish sort of scenario that the Supreme Court would then decide instantly in favor of the anti-abortion state. Am I too skeptical on that point? Or
that's where I get to say I'm not a lawyer, but we have one on the panel.
I don't know if it's too skeptical. I wouldn't put anything past the Supreme Court, but I do think New York is also working on a state law that is at least attempting to protect all legal conduct that happens in New York, conduct that is legal in New York. So if their providers are legally doing something that they are allowed to do in New York, they're trying to make laws that protect that conduct, no matter if somebody's coming from another state or not. And so cooperating with law enforcement requests, you might say, well, this conduct that you're talking about is legal in our state. So we're not going to cooperate with you to provide information about that because it's legal here. I'm not sure what they can do, but I imagine there are going to be states that are trying to expand their jurisdiction over their people, preventing them from getting abortions anywhere as much as they possibly can, and other states fighting back to provide the maximum protection for their providers. And I put it in the chat, but I'll mention just for people who aren't on this call, this article called The New Abortion Battleground. And the authors are David S. Cohen, Greer Donley, and I might not get this right, but Rachel Rebouchet, perhaps. And it is the most recent discussion that I've seen about all the ways that states are going to be vying against each other for protections of their citizens. And it really is a fascinating article. And, you know, just to make it real, for example, there's going to be criminal, but also civil. So he's thinking in Texas, say that there is a young woman in Texas trying to get an abortion. Nothing's available in Texas. Also, she's poor. So she does a GoFundMe account. And say, I see that in North Carolina, and I fund her from North Carolina through GoFundMe. And then she takes that money and goes to California and obtains an abortion. So can now the people in Texas under SB 8 sue me from North Carolina for aiding and abetting that under their civil law, and also sue the provider in California? Now, hopefully Hayley's bill will have passed and they can't, and that provider will be protected, but I think there's going to be a fight. I think there's going to be a fight between the states.
Well, I think, you know, you're going to end up with people who can only set foot in some states in the US because there's an arrest warrant over their head in one state and they're protected in another. That you're going to see a situation where, well, you have to move your assets to a bank that's in this state and not that one, because if it's in that state, well, they'll get frozen by Texas authorities. I mean, really, to me, the historical examples that come to mind are things like, you know, the Fugitive Slave Act, and really a level of you know, open warfare between states over the legal protection that we haven't seen in recent years. But I'll note as an unfortunate to be an unfortunate downer, the New York bill that passed, it actually only applies to information that's requested without a valid court order. So if Texas officials were to come with a warrant or a subpoena, it no longer would apply.
Mhm.
At S.T.O.P, we're pushing a couple bills that would apply in that situation, but we haven't seen anything enacted along those lines in New York yet, at least as far as I'm aware. And I do think, though, that while a lot of these questions are somewhat opaque and will be decided in the coming years, we know that these companies can simply be banned from keeping the data to begin with. You know, that to me seems like the easy win.
Right.
All right, let's go to the next question from Jesse. How can we share information for self-managed abortion care with people who need it and aren't aware of their options? I'm particularly wondering about rural areas needing access to this information, having only the internet. Would VPNs help at all? Encrypted services like Signal? I can't pregnant and would be willing to do searches for those who may need abortions, but I don't know how to safely convey that information. I think this is going to be such a crucial issue because, you know, like we were talking earlier, you know, librarians will fight like hell to make sure that you can search for that at a library, but it's unclear whether a lot of other networks are going to be censored, and it's going to be unclear how much of a risk you run searching for these things.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Hayley.
I'm just trying so we have some guides out for people. I think a lot of organizations have actually put out really helpful guides about, you know, thinking about your app use, thinking about as much as possible, sort of compartmentalizing, you know, if you're going to be doing searches, you know, if you can get a burner phone, get a burner phone. If you can do them, you know, using privacy protective services, all of that is true. I think, you know, trying to set up support networks and being really, really thoughtful about the ways that you come to agreements within those networks of how you're sharing data, how you're using data, how you're retaining data. All of that is really important. And I'm happy to drop links to those guides into the chat. I think but it is a really hard question. And the thing that, again, not very hopeful, right? But when we were making those guides, we were really trying to figure out the line between giving people false hope that there is a lot of stuff that they can do, and making them completely despair because there's not a lot of stuff they can do. You know, I think to me, it really is about you know, limiting the data that goes into these pools in the first place, and draining those pools as much as possible. So there definitely are things that we can do, and I think we're going to see a lot more movements crop up to help each other out as much as we can. But it is really hard. It's a really, really hard question.
And Chris has a note on here. It's scary to me that the easy path is convincing Google to stop spying on people. I totally feel you on that. And I agree. And, you know, there was the letter that 42 members of Congress, I believe, sent to Google to say, why are you keeping information that you don't need to keep? And, you know, look, we're not going to just be able to get all companies to, you know, say, yeah, advertising money, who cares? We're not going to accomplish that. But there should be some targeted ways. So, for example, if you saw some of the excellent reporting from the Markup and Reveal recently on Meta's Pixel, that was on the sites of all of these crisis pregnancy centers, no surprise, and they probably don't care anyway, but also showed up on hospitals and actual legit medical, you know, groups. And so why is that there? I mean, why is the Meta Pixel on Novant Health's site? And some of these were found inside the patient portals. And so I think that there are some steps that people could take to say, you know, we can forego, you know, and I know that Facebook says that it is trying to filter out and not collect certain sensitive data. They certainly are saying that they're trying to do that, and they could get even better at doing that. But one way would be to say health and groups can't put the Metapixel on their sites.
Yeah, and the idea that Facebook is somehow going to be the force that protects our privacy is always something I find that even harder to conceive than Google reforming its businesses. But I will note that, like, one of the most alarming examples that the markup has found has been that, Planned Parenthood has 70 different cookies and ad trackers and third-party trackers on its website. And they're a fantastic organization, they're doing amazing work, they're saving lives, but it's representative of how a lot of organizations are going to have to harden their digital infrastructure if they want to safely provide care in a post-Dobbs America.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's yet another facet, right? But just, yeah, I do encourage nonprofits to think about their own privacy policies, about what's on their own websites. A lot of nonprofits use kind of turnkey solutions, right, to set up their websites, to set up sort of their sign-ons, that kind of thing. And it really has to be a deeper examination of where that information is going.
Okay, so now we've thoroughly depressed everyone. We thoroughly scared everyone. We've made them question the fate of humanity. Before we leave people to, like, hopefully Google an inspiring series of puppy and kitten videos just to make them feel joy again, or I just want to give people some hope. Like, we do see ways people can push back, and we do see tens and tens of millions of Americans who are unwilling to accept this as our future. So I just want to ask you each for at least one example of something that makes you hopeful that this is a fight that can be won, or that this is a struggle where we can push back in ways that protect pregnant people. Hayley, how about you?
Like, I can try. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that does give me hope, and I don't know if it's enough, but it does give me hope, is that there are a lot of people who have identified this issue and want to work on it, right? It's like, when we started thinking about, we do tech policy, we do data privacy. It's like, we're not the first person you're going to call as a reporter when the Dobbs decision drops, right? But we've been getting a lot of outreach from groups across the country, from groups who are focusing in different areas, right? So there's a lot of energy and attention being paid to how do we push back. And so I think one thing that encourages me is that there are a lot of people who want to find a solution, or who want to find ways to work together. And I can't manufacture will, so we can come up with a lot of solutions, but it's really, really encouraging to see how many people are invested in this and who really want to push back. So I guess the counter to hopelessness is that you're not alone, right? There are a lot of people out there, and they care a ton.
Hope is hard to come by. Hope is hard to come by, Albert. But so I want to start with something that sounds less hopeful, but it will lead to hopeful. And that is that I want to point out that these civil cases, civil laws, the criminal laws, they are essentially going to create an environment of fear and trepidation among women. That's what they're going to create. And we can't just look at cases won by plaintiffs in Texas or convictions obtained. We have to think about all the stuff that's happening before that. All the people who are threatened with suit, who have to respond to a suit, all the people who are surveilled, all the people who are arrested and who may be sitting in jail for some version of a law that would never in 5 million years pass muster, but nevertheless, they're sitting there while it gets worked out. What this shows us, to me, is that how much can be accomplished with just the surveillance and the investigation, just that possibility of liability or imprisonment. And what it shows to me is that it's refocusing us on the idea of the spectrum of reproductive justice. Yes, this right to abortion matters. It absolutely matters, but it's one part of this overall spectrum. And people have been talking about this for years. It's about reproductive justice. And what we are able to see from what's happening here is that it's about control. It's about control by the state of women and their bodies. That's what it is. And no one after this can pretend or say that it is anything else. And so maybe having that, having people energized by that understanding and willing to go out and make the best arguments we can, even though the Supreme Court is beyond depressing, we will find the people who can work for us in the states. We'll find people who can make a difference, health providers who care, law enforcement who cares. But talking about it in the right way as a spectrum of reproductive justice, I think is a start. And looking back at the amazing work that these folks have done in the past, showing us that direction will be a great thing to do.
Well, thank you both so much. I know it's a dark time. I know it's a hard fight, but I agree. There's so much power, there's so much energy, and there's so much hope in seeing, people come together to fight for reproductive justice. So thank you all for joining us for this month. We'll be back next month with the next installment of RadTech, and please keep safe and keep fighting until then. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
See you soon, I hope.
Yeah. Really glad we got to meet.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Will.